The accident report was brief. A line from an early 20th century ledger simply noted, "Worker fell. Fatal. Furnace still operational." But locals in Birmingham whispered something far stranger. They said the man who fell wasn't just a worker, he was the foreman. And his name, repeated in hushed tones for more than a century, was James Slag Wormwood. According to legend, he didn't simply fall. He was pushed, or pulled, into the searing, molten iron of the Sloss Furnaces. And though his body was consumed instantly, some claimed his voice still echoed against the towering stacks at night. The strange part? When the Sloss Furnaces were officially documented as a National Historic Landmark decades later, the name Wormwood never appeared in the records. No obituary. No work log. Just the story. And yet, Birmingham newspapers, ghost hunting teams, and night shift workers all repeat the same chilling detail. In a 6-year period, 47 men lost their lives under one foreman's watch. Sloss Furnaces isn't just a museum today. It's remembered as one of the most haunted industrial sites in America. Before we go deeper into the flames of history, let me pause and ask you something. Are you watching this at night, lights off, alone in your room? Or did you hit play in broad daylight, just to prove you're braver than most? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these sleepless stories travel across the globe. Because what begins as a simple industrial accident in Birmingham becomes one of the darkest ghost stories in American folklore. The roar of the furnaces may be long silent, but visitors swear they still hear footsteps crunching through soot, or feel unseen hands shove them near railings that overlook yawning pits of steel. And tonight, we're stepping inside the fire. Through official records. Through folklore. Through the terrifying experiences of people who swear they've seen the foreman who melted 47 men. But here's the thing, one witness claims that after a late-night tour, he followed heavy footsteps echoing across the upper platforms. They led to a rusted door of the old furnace control room. He swears he opened it, and what he saw ended his career forever. So tell me in the comments, have you ever been so terrified that you walked away from a job on the spot? When you first step onto the grounds of Sloss Furnaces, it doesn't feel like a museum. It feels like a skeleton of steel, giant smokestacks rising into the Alabama sky, rust bleeding across massive pipes, catwalks stretching like veins over a silent heart. But in 1882, this place was alive. It was the beating furnace of Birmingham. Colonel James Withers Sloss, a southern industrialist, saw more than farmland and red clay hills when he arrived here. He saw ore, limestone, coal, everything needed to fuel a city built on iron. He convinced investors that Birmingham could become the Pittsburgh of the South. And by the late 19th century, Sloss Furnaces was roaring, 24 hours a day. Imagine the sound. Not silence, but a relentless chorus, steam hissing through valves, molten iron pouring like rivers of fire, hammers striking steel with metallic screams. The ground itself trembled with each blast of the furnace. For the men who worked here, the noise was constant, the heat suffocating, and the danger inevitable. A blast furnace never sleeps. Inside, temperatures soared past 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Coal dust filled the air, stinging the lungs, while iron or dust clung to sweat and skin. The men who labored at Sloss were often poor, many immigrants, many African American workers who found themselves locked in one of the most hazardous jobs in America. They called the place the graveyard shift, and not without reason. Industrial accidents weren't statistics here. They were everyday realities. Men fell from catwalks slick with soot. Boilers exploded without warning. Burns, broken bones, suffocation, all were part of the rhythm of production. And yet Birmingham grew richer, its skyline stretching higher, each brick and rail birthed in the fire of Sloss Furnaces. But history always leaves gaps. Official ledgers recorded some injuries, some deaths, but whispers among the men told another story. That more lives were lost than the numbers suggested. That the hunger for production came before safety. And that one foreman, in particular, drove men harder than the steel itself. James Slag Wormwood. Even before his legend twisted into ghost story, his name carried the weight of cruelty. He was said to demand impossible quotas, to push men past exhaustion, to keep the furnaces roaring no matter the human cost. And as Birmingham prospered, the furnaces fed on more than ore. They fed on lives. The Iron Empire was rising. But beneath it, shadows deepened. And those shadows, soot, smoke, and suffering, would linger long after the fires went out. The men who labored at Sloss Furnaces carried scars the city never saw. They didn't write letters to the newspaper, and most of their names never made it into the official ledgers. Their stories lived in whispered warnings, traded in the dark corners of boarding houses and saloons after a shift that felt more like survival than work. One worker described the air itself as alive, so thick with coal dust that it seemed to crawl into his lungs, rattling in his chest like gravel. Another swore the furnaces moaned at night, as if the steel carried voices trapped within it. The danger was so constant that even silence felt threatening, a pause that promised something was about to break. Accidents became a grim rhythm. A man falling from a catwalk wasn't just an incident, it was an echo. Every clang of steel reminded the men of someone who didn't come back. And soon, they began to say the furnaces had a hunger. That it didn't just consume coal and ore. It wanted more. Among the workers, stories spread about shadows moving in the steam. Of tools thrown down by unseen hands. Of footsteps pacing the upper levels when no one was there. These weren't the tales of tourists or ghost hunters. They came from the very men who bled in the firelight. But what they feared most wasn't only the machinery. It was the man who commanded them. James Slag Wormwood. Foremen were always hard, but Wormwood was something else. He was said to keep men working 12-hour shifts with no breaks, forcing them up iron ladders slick with sweat and ash, screaming for more output while the heat stripped the flesh from their arms. One worker whispered that Wormwood treated men like fuel, just another thing to burn. And when bodies began to fall, too many, too fast, the men stopped blaming the machines. They began to wonder if something darker was watching over them, feeding on Wormwood's cruelty. The whispers spread beyond the gates of Sloss. Birmingham began to murmur that the furnaces were cursed, that the ground beneath them had soaked in too much blood. Some said the air itself was unholy, a mix of iron, smoke, and the restless dead. And as the body count rose, the fear solidified into legend. That Sloss Furnaces wasn't just dangerous. It was haunted. To understand why the Sloss Furnaces haunt people to this day, you have to know the man whose name still drifts through the smoke. His workers called him slag, a word meant for the molten waste left behind after iron was purified. It wasn't a title of respect. It was an insult, born out of contempt, and whispered when he was out of earshot. James Wormwood was a foreman in the early 1900s, a time when Birmingham was desperate to earn its name as the Magic City. But magic in this city came from fire, sweat, and human sacrifice. Wormwood embodied that sacrifice, not his own, but the lives of the men under him. Accounts describe Wormwood as a tyrant. He forced his crew into the most dangerous parts of the furnaces, sending men to scale ladders slick with molten residue, or to shovel or onto platforms where a single misstep meant death. He drove them harder than any other foreman, insisting they work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, even in the choking southern heat. It was under his rule that accidents multiplied. Falls, burns, suffocations. Official records counted at least 47 men dead during Wormwood's reign. Unofficial whispers say the number was higher. Men vanished into the flames, into the pits of molten steel, their deaths never written into company logs. But what turned Wormwood from a cruel boss into a legend was not just the bodies he left behind. It was the way he seemed to thrive on the fear. Workers swore they saw him smile when men collapsed from heat exhaustion. That he paced the catwalks at night, barking orders into the shadows as if unseen hands were still at work. And then came his death. In 1906, Wormwood himself fell from the highest tower into a pool of molten iron. Some claimed he slipped, dizzy from the toxic fumes. Others whispered the workers had enough, that someone pushed him into the fire he had forced them to feed. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Wormwood's body was never recovered. It was consumed, melted into the very iron he demanded from his men. That might have been the end of the story, an accident, a violent death in an already brutal workplace. But what followed kept Wormwood alive in a different way. Workers claimed to hear his voice long after he was gone, cursing them from the shadows of the furnaces. Tourists decades later reported seeing a figure on the catwalks, shouting at them to get back to work. James Slag Wormwood may have died in 1906. But the legend says his ghost never clocked out. The fire that took James Slag Wormwood should have silenced him forever. But if you speak with the night guards, the tour guides, or the paranormal investigators who prowl the ruins of Sloss Furnaces, they'll tell you the opposite. His shift never ended. Visitors describe the same sensation, a sudden shove from behind on the upper catwalks, as if an invisible hand were forcing them forward. Some stagger, some scream, but always, when they turn around, no one is there. One guide recalled hearing footsteps pacing in the dust above her head. Heavy boots, slow and deliberate, crunching along the steel grates. When she climbed the stairs to confront whoever was there, the footsteps continued, directly over her head. She realized the platform above had long since collapsed. Paranormal teams have flooded Sloss in recent decades, bringing cameras, EMF detectors, and digital recorders. They've captured chilling fragments, voices shouting over the hiss of static, commands like, "Get back to work!" or "Move faster!" One recording caught a sound that investigators swore was molten metal pouring, even though the furnaces have been cold for half a century. And it isn't just sound. Some investigators left with burns on their arms, strange welts shaped like handprints, raised red as if from steam. Others reported dizziness and hallucinations, much like the workers of the early 1900s who inhaled toxic fumes until they staggered to their deaths. Locals say Slag doesn't appear as a translucent shadow. He appears as a man. A hulking figure standing in the smoke, his voice loud and angry, his presence suffocating. And always, he is driving men back to the fire. Sloss Furnaces has been featured on nearly every major paranormal show, Ghost Adventures, Scariest Places on Earth, countless YouTube investigations. Time after time, the same story returns, a place where men died in the flames, and a foreman who refuses to rest. And here's where the fear deepens. Because even skeptics who dismiss ghost stories leave Sloss with the same uneasy feeling, that the air is too heavy, the silence too loud, the shadows too aware. One paranormal investigator once said, "You don't go to Sloss to find Slag. Slag finds you." But the most disturbing story isn't from a tourist. It comes from a worker who helped restore the furnaces in the 1980s. He was repairing a railing when he felt a hand grip his shoulder and shove him forward. He caught himself, but swore he heard a growl in his ear. He left the site and never returned. Which makes me wonder, have you ever walked away from a place because something you couldn't explain convinced you it wasn't safe? Tell me below. I want to know if you've ever trusted your fear enough to quit. Some numbers are too large to ignore, even when the details blur between fact and legend. In the stories told at Sloss Furnaces, the number is 47. 47 men who vanished, were burned, or were crushed under molten iron, all under the gaze of James Slag Wormwood. 47 lives claimed by fire, sweat, and cruelty. Official records, like the NRHP nomination and local industrial logs, confirm that workplace deaths were tragically common. Sloss was one of the most dangerous industrial sites in early Birmingham. Men fell from catwalks, boilers exploded, and molten iron claimed hands, arms, even whole bodies. But the records do not confirm 47 deaths in a single 6-year span under a single foreman. And yet, the legend persists. Local newspapers from the 1920s and modern folkloric accounts repeat the story with eerie consistency. Wormwood was ruthless, driving men into flames, punishing mistakes with cold indifference. Some historians note that the number 47 might have been symbolic, representing the sheer scale of human suffering rather than a precise headcount. It's hard to separate fact from fear. A single furnace could consume a man in seconds, leaving little evidence. Tools, boots, and scorched clothing sometimes survived, bodies did not. For workers, the deaths were palpable, immediate, and terrifying. One log mentions an accident in 1904. A worker slipped into molten iron while feeding a furnace. Another report details a ladder collapse that sent 3 men tumbling toward the pit. Night shifts became nightmares. The remaining workers whispered about a shadow on the catwalks, and voices that barked orders at impossible speed. They claimed that Wormwood's spirit lingered to ensure the work never slowed. Some accounts say he appeared with soot-streaked overalls, face partially burned, directing them with the same cruel precision he had in life. Visitors to the furnaces today describe the same sensations. EMF detectors spike in certain rooms, cameras catch orbs of light hovering over the pits, and guides swear the sound of heavy boots sometimes echoes from empty platforms. It's as if the 47 lives lost, and perhaps more, have left an imprint that refuses to fade. The number 47 is repeated over and over in ghost hunting reports, YouTube investigations, and local folklore. It has become more than a statistic. It's a talisman of fear, a symbol of the haunted industrial site that Sloss has become. 47 men, lost to fire, legend, and memory. Some researchers argue the number is an exaggeration, a story that grew from multiple smaller accidents. Others insist on its truth, citing interviews with families of workers and oral histories collected by preservationists. And in every telling, the shadow of Wormwood dominates the story, bridging the gap between history and horror. The truth is layered in soot, heat, and iron. History records the accidents. Folklore remembers the cruelty. Ghost stories preserve the terror. And in this furnace of fact and fiction, the line between what happened and what is felt blurs, leaving us to wonder, how many men truly perished here, and how many are still counted in the flames by a foreman who never truly left? For decades, Sloss Furnaces has drawn more than just curious tourists. Paranormal investigators, folklorists, and historians alike have come seeking proof. Proof of the foreman who never left. Proof of the 47 men lost in the fire. Proof that the furnaces themselves still carry the weight of a century of suffering. Skeptics often begin their tours armed with logic. They point to the NRHP nomination, the detailed logs of industrial accidents, and the official history. Yes, the workplace was dangerous. Yes, men died. But no, there is no verifiable record of a foreman named James Slag Wormwood orchestrating 47 deaths in 6 years. No ghostly figure is listed in the city archives. Yet even the skeptics admit something happens here that defies simple explanation. A lead historian once walked the catwalks with EMF detectors, expecting to catch electrical interference. Instead, readings spiked near a collapsed furnace platform, where no electricity runs and no wiring exists. Cameras left to record the silence captured strange shadows, moving independently of the crew. Local folklorists have traced the Wormwood legend back to oral traditions, finding stories repeated with uncanny consistency. Residents who grew up near the furnaces swear they heard footsteps late at night, or glimpsed a man pacing the upper walkways in soot-streaked overalls. Ghost hunting teams on YouTube often highlight these first-hand accounts, carefully noting where legend and memory intertwine. Paranormal investigators have conducted exhaustive overnight investigations, documenting temperature fluctuations, EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, and anomalous lights. Some claim these signals correspond to the exact areas where the furnaces once consumed men in molten iron. Guides report doors opening and closing by themselves, footsteps echoing on steel platforms, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. Skeptics suggest environmental factors, shifting metal, natural drafts, or misinterpretation of machinery creaks. But even accounting for physics, the consistency of reports over decades is remarkable. Tourists, students, and professional investigators alike experience the same sensations: chills along the spine, sudden pressure on the shoulders, whispers that vanish when approached. One historian commented, "Sloss is haunted not necessarily because of ghosts, but because of memory, the memory of industrial cruelty, human error, and repeated tragedy. The place absorbs the anxiety of all who work or visit here, and projects it back in forms people interpret as paranormal. Whether it is spiritual energy or psychological resonance, the haunted industrial site of Sloss continues to fascinate. Its legend has become inseparable from its documented history, a dangerous workplace turned museum, a legend turned storytelling engine, a site where fact and fear collide. And as you step closer to the furnace's heart, the question grows: are the stories of James Slag Wormwood the product of folklore, or something else entirely, an echo of lives violently ended, refusing to fade? It's one thing to read about the legend of James Slag Wormwood. It's another to hear it from the people who claim they've seen him, or felt him, walking the catwalks of Sloss Furnaces long after the fires went cold. A tour guide, who has led hundreds through the museum, recounted one evening when a group of students lingered near the upper platforms. She felt a sudden, heavy weight on her shoulder, as if someone had pressed against her with immense force. She spun around. Nothing. But behind her, a shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally across the railing, then vanish into the darkness. Another account came from a restoration worker in the 1980s. While repairing a railing near the molten iron pit, he felt an intense heat surge up from the floor below, though the furnaces had been silent for decades. As he looked up, he swore he saw a figure in soot-streaked overalls, standing with arms crossed, glaring down at him. The figure disappeared before he could call out. Visitors during ghost hunting expeditions have reported hearing orders barked in gruff, commanding voices. "Move faster!" or "Get back to work!" Cameras sometimes capture sudden orbs of light hovering near collapsed walkways, while EMF readings spike without explanation. One investigator, alone in the museum late at night, described the feeling of unseen eyes following every step he took. "I knew I wasn't alone," he said, "and I wasn't imagining it." Families of former workers have passed down stories of men who came home from shifts pale, trembling, and silent. One man's grandson recounted that his grandfather refused to talk about the furnaces, except to warn. "Slag is still there. He watches." Even skeptical visitors have felt it. A group of photographers, visiting during a midsummer evening, reported that their cameras repeatedly malfunctioned near the blast furnace platforms. Each time they reviewed the footage, shadows appeared where no one had been standing, sometimes moving against the light source, as if guided by unseen hands. It's not just sight or sound. Some speak of cold drafts that slice through the body, sudden changes in temperature, and a pressure in the chest like the weight of the foreman himself leaning close. One paranormal investigator likened it to standing in the presence of someone who refuses to leave, a force bound to the memory of violence, cruelty, and death. And yet, despite these reports, Sloss is still open to the public. Visitors continue to walk its walkways, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. Some leave shaken, some exhilarated, and some with questions that never leave them. These testimonies blur the line between memory and spirit, between legend and lived experience. They remind us that Sloss Furnaces is not only a site of industrial history but a place where stories of the restless dead persist, carried in whispers, shadows, and cold steel. Walk through Sloss Furnaces today, and you'll notice the artifacts that survived time and fire: rusted rails, scorched ladders, worn tools, and old work boots, blackened by soot and age. On their own, they are industrial relics. But among guides and investigators, these objects carry a story, sometimes whispered, sometimes felt in the spine. One small artifact sits quietly in a glass case, a scorched ledger from 1904. Its pages are brittle, ink-faded, yet still legible. It lists accidents, some mundane, some horrifying, men who slipped, who fell into vats, who were crushed by machinery. The names of 47 men appear in fragmented form, though the ledger doesn't explicitly mention James Slag Wormwood. Still, visitors report an uneasy feeling when standing near it, a pressure that makes the air thick and the walls feel closer than they are. A single work boot, preserved under glass, draws repeated attention. Guides claim that during night tours, the temperature around the boot drops suddenly. Cameras and EMF meters sometimes spike here, too, though no explanation exists for the anomalies. Some swear that, on certain nights, the sound of heavy boots pacing nearby can be heard, footsteps belonging not to the living. Even the furnaces themselves are artifacts. Walkways creak underfoot as they have for over a century. The steel walls are scorched, and the smell of iron lingers faintly, almost like the furnaces remember the men who fed them. Some guides leave offerings, a simple candle, a quiet word of respect. Visitors report that these small acts sometimes change the atmosphere, softening the oppressive weight, if only for a moment. There's also a railing where a collapse occurred decades ago. Investigators claim to have felt hands gripping them when no one was near, and to have heard muffled shouting, commands, protests, a voice that chills the blood. They trace these anomalies to the very spots where history records injuries, where workers vanished, and where legend says Slag himself fell. Even seemingly mundane objects carry echoes. Hammers still resting in their hooks, buckets left behind, a scorched helmet in the corner. They all feel alive with memory. Guides say that after a long day of tours, objects seem to vibrate in the quiet of the furnaces, as if holding on to the energy of those long gone. These artifacts serve as a bridge. They connect the documented horrors of industrial accidents with the whispers of legend. They remind visitors that Sloss Furnaces isn't just a museum, a building, or a steel skeleton. It is a vessel of memory, a place where history, tragedy, and the supernatural converge. And as night falls, some swear the artifacts themselves seem to watch. Boots shift slightly. Ladders creak. The old ledger rustles its brittle pages without a breeze. Sloss Furnaces is more than steel and brick. Its memory made tangible, a city's collective conscience forged in fire. The story of James, Slag, Wormwood and the alleged 47 men who died under his reign has seeped into Birmingham's cultural fabric. It is taught in whispered tales, repeated on ghost hunting shows, and shared in local legends that blur history and myth. Tourism thrives on it. Night tours, Halloween events, and special paranormal expeditions draw visitors eager to feel the chill of history, to sense the presence of a foreman who refuses to rest. People come seeking ghosts, but they leave with an uneasy connection to the lives sacrificed in the name of industry. The furnaces have become a symbol. The dangers of human ambition, the cost of progress, and the thin line between legend and lived reality. Psychologically, the impact is subtle but pervasive. Those who spend hours in the shadows of the catwalks report heightened anxiety, a sense of being watched, and an uncanny awareness of mortality. Even skeptics describe the oppressive atmosphere, the heat, the echoing steps, the metallic smell, reminders that danger once stalked this place, and that it may not have entirely departed. The legend of Slag Wormwood also serves as cautionary folklore. Children who grow up hearing the story learn about responsibility, cruelty, and consequences, though framed in whispers of terror. Adults, on the other hand, find in the story a complex tapestry of industrial history and human cruelty, wrapped in the thrill of the paranormal. Writers, YouTubers, and paranormal investigators continue to document their experiences, spreading the legend far beyond Birmingham. Videos, podcasts, and social media clips amplify the story, making it one of the most haunted industrial sites in America. And every time someone recounts an encounter, footsteps on empty catwalks, sudden cold spots, or fleeting shadows, the narrative grows, intertwining folklore with first-hand experience. And yet, there's a deeper layer. Sloss is not only haunted by ghosts but by memory itself. The horror of industrial accidents, the tragedy of lives lost, and the cruelty attributed to Wormwood linger in the consciousness of anyone who walks its halls. History, legend, and psyche overlap here, creating a place where fear feels not only real, but inevitable. One guide once said that the most unnerving thing isn't seeing a shadow or hearing a voice. It's the knowledge that someone, somewhere, suffered and perished here, and that echoes of that suffering persist. Which brings me to this. Have you ever been somewhere that made you question your own courage? A place that felt alive with memory and menace? Drop it in the comments. Tell me your story. Because Sloss Furnaces doesn't just haunt a city, it haunts everyone who steps inside. As you step away from the towering stacks of Sloss Furnaces, the echoes linger. The roar of molten iron is long silent, yet the silence itself hums with memory. Rusted catwalks and scorched ladders are cold to the touch, but the stories they carry remain hot, burning in whispers, footsteps, and shadows. We've traced the life and legend of James, Slag Wormwood, the tyrant foreman who drove men to their deaths. We've walked through the horror of 47 lives lost, or perhaps more, depending on whose account you trust. We've felt the reports of footsteps pacing above empty catwalks, the whispers in the night, and the inexplicable presence of a figure who refuses to rest. Sloss Furnaces is a museum, a landmark, a monument to industrial ambition, but it is also a haunted industrial site. One where history, legend, and memory converge to create an atmosphere that defies explanation. You can study the records, trace the oral histories, and examine the artifacts, but there is something that cannot be measured or catalogued. Something that lingers like smoke and steel in the lungs. Visitors often ask guides if they will see slag themselves. The answer is always the same, maybe. Maybe in a shadow along a catwalk, a glint in the corner of the eye, or a whisper behind the ear. Maybe in the chill that suddenly grips your shoulders, reminding you that some stories refuse to die. Sloss teaches us that the past is never fully gone. It lives in the objects left behind, in the legends told across generations, and in the lingering presence of those who were forgotten, or forced to vanish too soon. It is both a historical site and a psychological one, where fear is not only imagined but felt, deeply and personally. So, as you close your eyes tonight, or walk past steel and brick in quiet contemplation, consider this: the furnaces no longer burn molten iron, but some say that the foreman still walks. The men may be gone, but perhaps, in some corner of the building, their memory remains, alive in shadow and steel. And now, the sleepless question: if you ever had to spend a night there, would you keep the lights off, or would you run? Think carefully. Some questions aren't meant to be answered, they're meant to follow you into the dark.